Welcome. I'm so glad to see, old friends, new friends, and I'm so glad you came. And I went around asking you what interested you about this big, long story, and because I wanted to know what to focus on. So these are all, I could go through the whole thing and we could be here for 3 hours, but we don't really need to do that. Oh, it works. Okay. So I've heard it said that, to start a lecture like this, you tell a joke and then people like you and whatever. I have a better method. Okay. I was going to wait till the end, but I went and you've seen this book, right? Okay. Syracuse wanted $40 for it, university, and not very many people bought it. I never got a single dime for it because if they don't sell $100 worth of, at $1 a piece, right? They don't send you money. So when they offered it cheaply, I bought the entire inventory. Okay, I have it selling at the Cayuga Museum at the Seward House, and but I figured I'm going to give it away today. You can all take one of these copies if you bought one in the past. I'm not going to rebate your money, but you're welcome to it. Good plan. Okay. Don't leave without one. If you want me to sign it, you got to open it up. Okay. So I was getting let me tell you what I can. This is sort of what I finished with, but I'm going to begin with two. When I was working on my PhD in the geography department at Syracuse, not that long ago, though it's in the 90s, okay? And I had a wonderful mentor, Donald Meinig, who said none of his students had ever studied Auburn. So, okay, I'm going to study Auburn. And, I'd been, I was in my 40s at the time. I'd been in business for years, building things for people. And I really was sensitive to where the money came from and how it was spent, because you couldn't pay me if you didn't make money somehow. And I'd also been in what I called a frontier at the time, the very southernmost county in southwest Florida, Collier County, had been a frontier of a sort for maybe 100 years before I got there. I lived there for 7 years. And what I learned very quickly was the people that made money were the ones who came with a little bit and bought land. Okay? Matter of fact, just happened this past year. Sort of an extended family member that had gotten there in the 30s and bought like a mile square on the ocean, right? Sold it this year for $630 some million. I can't, right? So the land is an essential part. And in trying to understand, my objective in understanding Auburn was to explain the economic drivers, engines that created the big houses on South Street, right? And it was very cool because they sort of died. It's not like you're studying, Brooklyn or something where they build on top of things. It sort of died at a certain point. So you could actually get into it and find out, who made money and how. And that's really what my Auburn book is about. But I decided to start with the land because I wanted to know who came here with a little bit of money, bought land, and then became land dealers, land speculators, and then did they keep it, live here, use it to develop the area? That was important to me. Well, this map will become more important, but the land around us is the new military tract that was given away, supposedly, to soldiers after the Revolutionary War. And so I decided, it kind of got fun. I had a summer, and I spent months in the Cayuga County office building reading through the old records, right? And it became sort of like a mystery, and familiar names would come up like Aaron Burr and things like that. And so I made it, and then at night I would, put everything into charts and graphs. And all this, I think I recorded more than 4,000 records, and then put them into tables and whatnot. And all my research is in the basement in the history room of this library, assuming they're willing to keep it there. I've heard rumors I'll get it somewhere. But I wanted the research to be available. If you don't know, I'm retired. It's the smile on my face. Right? So what I found out, and this is sort of the important data that I developed over. These are ends, how many records I recorded in each year. And these are, a nickel an acre, 10 cents an acre. Can you read it? Is it two?
Yes.
Okay. And then when we get to the critical years, $75, 95, 6, and 7. It's $1.09, $1.46, $1.86. You're watching the growth of land prices by all the records that are in the books, right? Buy this indenture, so and so bought for so much this land for, and you record it and try to find out who they are. So, somewhere around 1999, long after this research was done, I was trying to put together the first draft of this book on Auburn, and I was doing articles, trying to get tenure and things like that. So I was doing articles, and I was working on this data, right? And I get a call from the New York State Department of the Attorney General's office of the New York State saying, "What do you know about land values in central New York in these dates?" And I'm going, "Well, yeah, have a heck of a lot, right? How'd you even find out about me?" They said, "Well, we have to file a report in court in 3 days. Can you write a report and have it ready for us?" And then he told me how much he was going to pay me by the hour. And so I said, "Okay, I'll do it." It would have been I would have much preferred working for the sunny side, but it really didn't matter. I'm only interested in getting the numbers right? So I filed that report, and I became part of the land claim case. And then I went back a year later, and with other reports, I spent a good bit of time billing for about half of it, but researching this particular question, which is why, right? When this is the price that I knew was being paid in the new military tract, which is, I considered it sort of a laissez-faire market where people were buying and selling, that nobody controlled it. There were no proprietors of large tracts of land or anything. Why was this? And this is my chart of all this. This is the bids for the Cayuga Reservation in 1795, right? Or 96. And it's like 3 times what I knew the land to be worth, right? So that was worth investigation, right? And I think that if you're interested in finding more about that, the book's available here in the library, right? I came up with some answers, but I don't think that's really the question you'd be most interested in. So I want to sort of go back and look at some other things, other conditions. By doing this research, I learned a lot of really interesting things about the early settlers here in this area, right? This would be a map. It's not a correct map. It's not pre-1763, which is the end of the French and Indian War, but it shows the territory of the Mohegans, the Oneidas, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, right? Then after the Treaty of, is it Utrecht or whatever the treaty was at the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain decided we're going to make a line, I think they called it proclamation line, or the line of property. Does that sound right? Okay. And it basically goes all the way down the coast to wherever the rivers drain to the Atlantic or to the Mississippi, right? And that was the line. And it was the line past which settlers are not supposed to go, right? Which is sort of like demanding it not to snow today. I mean, it's not, you couldn't do that at the time. So you'll notice the Mohawks have lost their land by this time. And you've got the Oneida, Onondagas, Cayuga, and Seneca in their territories. Well, you probably know the history of what happened to them. Because when the revolution came about, right, most of the Haudenosaunee were allied with the British because they'd been so successful in turning the tide of the French and Indian War by supporting the British, and they got benefits from that. So they were fighting on the side of the British, with the exception of the Oneida and the Tuscarora. This is a map drawn from the Sullivan expedition, right? Okay, so during the war, in a bad year, I think it was 79, a bad year for the continental side. Washington sent two armies, right, under Clinton and Sullivan, to destroy, basically to wipe out the presence of the Haudenosaunee in central New York, right? And they went up through, they travel up here and they burn the castles, which are the cities. They burn their really nice houses with doors and windows and hardware and whatnot. They burn their fields of corn. They learn that it's really good land because the native people were very good at agriculture, right? But the settlers didn't think that. The soldiers thought they were, primitive whatevers. And so they thought it was the land, right? And so the reputation for this being really great land passed among the Continental soldiers. In the story of the dispossession of the Haudenosaunee, Washington is the villain. He had his reasons. And immediate objects of the expedition are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. We're talking about ethnic cleansing in a pure form, right? Making the destruction of their settlements so final and complete as to put it out of their power to derive the smallest succor or help from them, okay? Drive them out because they were raiding settlements all across New York, right? The best reference that I've seen for this, to look at it from the side of the settlers in various parts of New York, the frontier at this time, comes from my friend Charlie Apple. Did you ever know Charlie? He was he wrote a book because his family settled Ithaca right after the war, even before, right? And he wrote this really interesting, it's self-published, you got to go on Amazon to get it, but it's a terrific book talking about how dangerous things were for the settlers because they were being raided by the Haudenosaunee, right? So there's a good source for you. If you're interested in looking at it from the Native American ground, the best source I've seen is Alan Taylor. Alan Taylor's a prize-winning historian, wrote a great book about Cooperstown, right? And if you want to look at it from the Native point of view, this is a really great source, okay? And I learned a whole lot from him. So, anyway, they've been driven out. The war ends, right? I think it's 1784, there's a treaty signed by the federal government saying, because of the atrocities that you've perpetrated, we're taking all your land. Mostly he's talking about the Cayuga and the Onondaga land and leaving you with these reservations, right? Very strident statement from the federal government. And so that's really when these two reservations were left behind, the Cayuga and the Onondaga Reservation. Seneca has a whole different story because they were still afraid of the Seneca allying themselves with the British. The British still had their forts, what's it called, the fort at the other, near Niagara, maybe it's called Fort Niagara, right? And so the Seneca had sort of a geopolitical power in this case. So they were left a little out of it. And the culmination of this book is the treaty, the Canandaigua Treaty in 1794, when the native groups, the Haudenosaunee groups, were validated in the ownership of their various territories, right? Basically, their reservations. So 1794 is also the time when the state government is trying to buy the land from the Cayuga. And this is a map we'll get back to, but this is sort of the large land grants and large territories in central New York. And I'll get back to this a little later because I want to describe how New York State and Massachusetts, a little bit of Connecticut, et cetera, basically gave away the land cheap, right? And it's a hell of a story. And there's some intriguing elements to it. So let's get back to this, okay? So to settle the disagreements about which state owned what land going west, right? And Massachusetts charter said from sea to shining sea. You got the whole, they didn't know what that meant, okay? So Massachusetts basically had the same right to New York's Western Territory as New York did, right? So they made an agreement, came to an agreement in Congress, and it was not Congress, it was under the Articles of Confederation. And they agreed to let New York have this land as sovereign land, right? And Massachusetts got to sell it, okay? Which leads to, I tell you, the stupidity of our governments, especially when they're led by rich people. You can leave that one alone, but basically it's astonishing. So Massachusetts turns around and wants to sell this land as fast as possible. Why? Because they have debts and whatnot incurred from the Revolution, right? So at first they sell it to Phelps and Gorman. One's from Connecticut, the other's from Massachusetts. They come up with a syndicate of investors to buy all that land, right? And they were going to buy it with discounted currency. That is paper money given away during the Revolution by the states, by the federal government, but basically in Massachusetts securities that were worth pennies on the dollar. So this syndicate got together and said, we'll buy it from Massachusetts. They got to pay us 100%, right? We can buy these things for a nickel or a dime, right? And get a full dollar from them. So they start, collecting partners and all that. And then they have to make their deal with the Seneca that has the control of this territory, right? And they do. It's a long story. It's wonderfully documented in the Taylor book, right? And there's other books about it, the treaties. But so they finally get possession, right? And then they can't pay for it. Because I think the theme of my book and of the story about land is that basically nobody has any money. Nobody has any money. At the end of the Revolution, there's only a limited number of millions of dollars among everybody in the country, right? So they think they were going to make this great deal, buy it cheap, right? Didn't work out, so they gave it back to the state of Massachusetts, keeping this part, okay? Now, this is a map of the rich investors that invested with Phelps and Gorham, right? They each bought basically a township. They said, I'll buy a township, whatever, for so little. And then they get stuck with it. They might not have paid it off, but Phelps and Gorham got enough money to pay for this, right? And it reverted back to Massachusetts. Are we familiar with this? No. Sort of. This is the most interesting thing. We'll get back to this later. But this was cheating among one of the syndicates that got involved in the Cayuga Reservation purchase, because that's all the land they could get. So they got their surveyor to cheat. And this is actually quite a bit of land going from, the border to Lake Ontario. All right. A better map, kind of fun.
There's still a preemption road that basically runs from the lake down to the Pennsylvania border along.
Yeah. They had to settle it when they resold it, right? They had to settle that spot, right? These are the people, if you can find their names, I haven't really looked, that are the rich investors from Boston mostly and places like that who invested with Phelps and Gorham and ended up stuck with a township of land that then they had to try to make money on. And they might have paid as much as $1 an acre for their purchase, not knowing what they were doing. So this is kind of an interesting map, right? There's another side of this map, which is what was left of that first section that Phelps and Gorham had. Well, what happens is Robert Morris, remember him? The financier of the Revolution, right? So he sees opportunity, he's the money guy. And he immediately makes a deal with Massachusetts to buy the rest of the land. Okay? So, and he buys it it's in the book, for pennies an acre, right? Massachusetts is just trying to clear up its debt, right? So he turns around and sells these remaining parcels of that first section, right, to the richest guy in England, or one of them, the Earl of Bath, right? Which is one reason why Bath is the name of this town, okay? And two other people, the sheriff of Nottingham, I don't know, the two other people, you can look it up, right? I'm 75 and retired. I don't really remember these things. Okay, so you fight the revolution, so many tens of thousands die, right? And then what do? You sell it back to them on the cheap. Oh, it gets worse, okay? So then there's the next section. Okay, all right. Well, let's go back to this one. All right, so if you look at the western section, right? 3 million acres, whatever. Robert Morris sells that right away to a collection of Dutch bankers. So it becomes the Holland Land Company land, right? Right? For, I think that's 30 cents an acre, something like that, okay? Yeah, you can check. There's a research you can use, okay? So what's left in between, okay, is this section here. Robert Morris does some speculating that gets him in trouble. He ends up in debtor's prison. His son takes over what is called the Morris Reserve, okay, the little slip of land. It's not small, right? And let me state from the beginning, this is very good land, all of it. You know the farmers all around here, okay? So Robert Morris now sells these pieces of townships to other rich people, right? Who then get on the hook for paying it off and getting settlers to stay on the land. So one of the remarkable maps that I have to show you is this one, right? This is all the land in New York State after the Revolution that was sold cheaply to Europeans. And there's a serious impact. The consequences of this, you can see it in the landscape around us. Because where were the profits of farmers going and trying to pay off their land for a century or so? It's going back to Europe. We'll talk about that a bit. Okay, what do we have next? So I became really interested in different ways in which the new military tract was sold to individuals instead of to these large companies. That's why I knew that my charts of the value of land were pretty reliable. Nobody was trying to make the market good, work for them, okay? The book by a colleague from a Don Meinig student before me on the Holland land purchase is called The Developer's Frontier, right? In other words, they hired people to develop their land. Same with the Pulteney people, right? But this was sort of laissez-faire. And how do I know the value of things and how the value of things change with credit? There's these things to look at. This is the township that I have now 2 properties in, right? This is Aurelius. And where are we? We're somewhere right in there. Well, right about there right now, okay? And so not only if you don't know the history of the new military tract, when they couldn't recruit enough soldiers, try to motivate them, the war was going bad, New York decided to, like the federal government, not federal, the continental people, right? They offered soldiers a really good incentive, 600 acres of land. They didn't say where, right? But they offered it. They knew it would be in New York. But there were 2 other elements to this because they were not supposed to get 600 acres. They were supposed to get 500 acres, right? Each soldier got 500 acres. Each lieutenant got 1,000. Each major got 2,000. General got, more land. As a matter of fact, this piece of land right here, this one, which is part of Auburn, went to a general from the Army. It was balloted. It was picking names out of a hat. And he held on to it for a bunch of years and sold it for $4,000. What's his name? I can't remember. Okay, but what else is going on here is the federal government is offering these soldiers 100 acres, probably somewhere in Ohio. There's the Federal Reserves in Ohio, right? So by separating this land into 600-acre parcels, right, they said, give us 100 acres, right, and we'll sell it at auction, right, and everything will be fine. But if you want to keep it, give us your federal land, right, your 100 acres that is in Ohio somewhere, and, that's fine, right? So you can have the whole 600 acres. But they also had another thing they wanted. If you notice, there's smaller 50-acre lots. As a matter of fact, I happen to know that my 50-acre lot, is somewhere down here. Anyway, John L. Hartman's brother bought it, and I just happen to know that originally, right? So you've got 50 acres. Now the 50 acres were to pay for the survey. And so they said, the state said, give us $5.65 or whatever it was at the time. Not much, right? And you keep the 50 acres, but if you don't want to pay us, right? And think of that. For 50 acres, that's a dime an acre, right? If you don't want to pay us, we'll sell it at auction, right? And the worst thing about this is the state's hundreds were always in the southeast corner of the lot, right? Just random, wherever the lot was, that's where it was. But the 50-acre lots was taken from whatever the surveyors thought was the best corner of your lot. So it's another insult, right? But these were sold at auction, right? So, and we know the dates and we know how much. So this is when the surveyors' 50s went at auction in 1792, right? They went for 33 cents an acre at auction, right? And we'll come back to the names on this list here, right? But these are New York rich, aggressive. I got this from the New York State books. It's easy enough. You can find this yourself. But these were sort of a new generation of aggressive entrepreneurs, whatever. And there's more to that story, right? 2 years later, they sell the 100-acre lots, right? And this is in 1794. But these reach $100.45 an acre, right? Why is that? Because even though the price is higher than my price that I found in the New Millwright Tract, they were offering credit terms. And credit becomes the real, in a world with no money, right? Credit's the critical thing, right? So the price went way up because I think 25% down, balance due, and a state mortgage. Okay, so you could buy a lot for $1.44 an acre, and pay 40 cents an acre down, and then you could maybe wait for somebody to pay you a little more for it, and you make your profit. It's like buying things on margin in the stock market. Make sense? Okay, so credit really matters. But here's the thing, and I think this is possibly new ground. Possibly this will, historians will follow this in the future. I don't know. But we have to go back to what happened between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, right, and James Madison, when they did the negotiation, 1790 probably, to determine what to do with the national debt, right? And the agreement was made, one of the few times Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison ever agreed on anything, right, was that they could put the capital on the shores of the Potomac River, right next to Washington's, house. But Hamilton gets, as Secretary of the Treasury, he gets to assume the national debt and create a national debt, which very successful because today it's what, 30-some trillion dollars? Is that what it is? I mean, right? But he was of the belief that a national debt stabilized the economy. And it's not a bad point. But there's something really seedy in this story, which is, that Hamilton was a follower, he was a disciple of Robert Morris. Hamilton was learning all these things on the fly. Brilliant guy, wrote the entire economy, wrote the entire army rules. He was so brilliant, right? But he was under the sway of Morris, who had talked to Congress, right? Way back, not Congress, but probably Continental Congress, way back in 1782, right? Thinking the war debt will be a primary method of creating wealth among the lucky few, right? Okay? Enrich moneyed men, right? He encouraged people to speculate on all that cheap currency, not worth a continental, right? The continental dollars, not worth the script that was written out to buy food for the army and whatnot, both by the states and by the continental army, et cetera, right? Congress was no better then than they are now in giving money. They don't like to, right? So those moneyed men would spend little and reap huge rewards. And these rewards would be paid for by taxes on the American people, right? And this is what happened, right? All of a sudden, all these speculators, and I studied a bunch of them. My favorite guy was William J. Friedenberg, who started Skinny Atlas, right? And that's in my Auburn book. These moneyed men would buy everything they could on the cheap. They'd buy soldiers, rights to their lots, to their military lots. They'd buy, dollars that were only worth a dime, not dollars at the time, but, money in script. They would buy any kind of debt, right? And they'd hold on to it with the idea that someday the federal government was going to come along and pay them back at par. You know what par means, 100% of value. So you buy something for a nickel, you go to the bank, you go to the federal government, they give you $1, right? There's no money in the country, right? But these rich guys have enough to get involved. So if you go back to this, when these guys paid 33 cents an acre, they had that much money, right? They had to pay in cash, right? Or maybe not. When it came to this one, most of their money was gone. They paid for this with debt. So what we have here, these names, are a pretty good sign of who those moneyed men were that took advantage of this particular peculiarity in American history and became rich enough with their, buying cheap and selling at par, right, to be speculators in the new military tract and then later in the Cayuga Reservation. Now, that's kind of, I call it the assumption effect. I don't know if it's going to stick, but somebody who knows more of history than me wrote, breaks new ground. Well, I'd be very pleased if that's true, but it's such an American story, isn't it? Right? What happens subsequent to this, that you find out if you read certain sources, is that the settlers out there who don't have any money and they're getting taxed, right, are furious because they know this is exactly what's happening, right? That they're being asked to pay the money that went back to the rich people because they bought up those cheap securities, right? And so we have the Whiskey Rebellion. They're taxing whiskey, right? Because the federal government has no money. And then Shays Rebellion. These are both well-known cases of where the settlers were not stupid, right? They were not. They knew exactly what was happening to them, and they were resisting as best they could. In terms of their Whiskey Rebellion, they would close off roads. They would attack sheriffs trying to collect the money. You have a question back there?
I'm just curious, how many of the speculators actually ended up moving, setting up a house in the lands that they were speculating on?
Well, this is, I'm very clear about it in my Auburn book that what happened is the new military tract market sort of died around 1795 and 6, right? That's when the money had been spent, and they got a lot of these investors had many lots that they had bought from soldiers for £5, the 2 drinks, right? I'll take your 500 acres for £5. Their officers did a lot of it. And so what happened is there was a lot of fraud. So they set a commission, I think it's called the Onondaga Commission, and maybe 2/3 of the lots had to be challenged in the new military tract. But in the end, I think there was real money to be made right away, and then later it died up, okay? And they stopped investing. That's my observation.
But none of the speculators ended up being actual settlers.
Well, some did, like William Friedenberg, and others, Robert Dill, who had where the Cayuga Museum is, and Bostwick, who bought the acreage right here. There's, I wouldn't call them necessarily speculators, but like Dill was an officer and Friedenberg was not, but he was a rich New York merchant, and others. And so, you have it's quite a story. To me, it's like a revelation, and it's consistent with everything else we've learned. I think that it also speaks to the difference between what we call the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian idea of development of the country's land resources. And Jefferson's idea was the land was supposed to fall into the hands of small yeoman farmers, right? It's male, but Hamilton was get as much as you can into the hands of the rich, because they're the ones who can develop it. And that was his theory. You'll find in the book on Auburn, I study the difference between Seneca Falls and Auburn, right? Seneca Falls is a very Hamiltonian situation. Some of the richest men in New York buy all of the resources in Seneca Falls. It's got really good power, and and it's it's all in one area. Whereas Hardenberg, buys one of the lots, and Bostwick buys some lots, Dills buys some lots, others, and they sell it to anybody who comes along. You can buy a power lot in Auburn for $50. It's a lot of money back then, but $50, it's a big difference. And the answer that comes through, Auburn's Auburn, and Seneca Falls is Seneca Falls, right? Auburn developed rapidly, attracted smart lawyers, merchants, industrialists. Seneca Falls stagnated for about 30 years, right? And as a matter of fact, those rich investors lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in their investment because they didn't let people buy their land and use it, right? They were trying to control it. So that's a lesson that I find makes sense. So a lot of you want to know are more interested in what happened to the Cayuga. So this is the map that the surveyors went out and drew of the Cayuga Reservation. And you remember where that is. It's the north end of Cayuga, like we all know it well, right? Okay. And when you study the history, and I had access to all the documents that went to the court from both sides. And, I was just interested in the facts, not the, well, what about their use of Waterloo for, getting eel at a certain time of the year? And what about this? I'm just interested in the American economy value of land, whether that's a good or bad way to approach it, but that was my job, right? So when you read these histories, you find that the Cayuga fractured into two groups, right? Where the reservation was made, nobody from the Cayuga settled in it except for a small group. So there were the Western Cayuga, the Eastern Cayuga, the Lake Cayuga, whatever. Small groups settled in the Cayuga Reservation. This is what was left behind for them when it was purchased by the state. There are constant arguments among the Cayuga about, we didn't sign these agreements to sell the reservation. The small group from here made a deal with the governor to sell it for a certain amount, and which really comes to about 50 cents an acre, right? And in an annuity, right? And the ones that are out west, they're with the Seneca out west in the Buffalo area. They're hostile to this. They want to get the hell out. That's my impression. They've lost the war. They don't want to live among the people they were fighting with. Some of them are still fighting in Ohio. Something went on in Sandusky, Ohio, and so you have to interpret that. I'm not the person to do that. I'm just saying that there was a lot of strong statements from Cayuga leaders from the West, right? We need you to buy our land properly. Okay, to the governor, et cetera. And so Governor Clinton set a meeting, and they meet 2 times and finally come to an agreement to sell the land for what comes to an annuity amount that comes to about 50 cents an acre, right? That's a really interesting history to go into. I do suggest there's a lot of really good books looking at it from the Haudenosaunee side, especially the one I showed you from Taylor. Lawrence Hauptman, who, let's just say he's not on my side on things, right? Wrote a whole bunch of books mostly about the Oneida. The Oneida case is completely different because they were revolutionary allies, right? But, the reservation is bought from the Cayuga in 1795. All right, it's surveyed into 250 acre plots, and it's put up for auction, right? Okay. The legislature authorized buy it for 50 cents, sell it for $2, right? The judge in the case that started that I participated in 1999 said that's an obvious case of a fraudulent intent, right? You buy for 5, you sell for 20. What good is that? So he believed it was a fraudulent sale. But what happened when it went up for auction is what really pissed off the Cayuga, right? Which is it sold for an average of $4.60 an acre, right? And below the castle, below the Cayuga Ferry, right, which is here, right, $6 an acre. That's the best land in the reservation, the most developed by the Cayuga. Well, immediately, we sold it for pennies, and you took all that money. They've sued every chance they got. They actually got all the money that was paid at the auction from the state in an agreement to pay it off in 1909 or something. Then a judge killed it, and then Franklin Roosevelt brought it back again. So, this is a case that just went on forever. And the reason that they could sue, right, is that New York State never had the treaty to buy the reservation certified by the Congress. And that's the law. The Trade and Intercourse Acts of 1790 and 1792 said only the federal government can sell land and buy land, right, from native peoples, right? So it comes up as a case. They have a reason to sue. They sue, and I got involved, right? Now, when I made my report, I said, well, what's the land worth? And without even knowing much else about it, I said it was between 40 cents and $1 an acre, depending on who was buying it and what kind of credit they had. right? And that was pretty fair given what I knew. Now, if they'd sold it 5 years later, it would have been a different story. The market was moving fast, right? I don't really shy away from that as much as I've learned since, because when I started studying, well, we have to see what happened to those sales, okay? If you look on the left, and things aren't very dark here, but the darker, the higher the value, right? Same degree of darkness on this map. This is how much the state resold the lots from, because they mostly reverted back to the state, because nobody paid for their land, okay, in this deal. What happened was the state offered this deal, okay? You could you could bid whatever you wanted to, but you only had to give us 10 pounds. At the time, I calculate $2.32 a pound, others $2.50, but whatever it is. So you can buy a $250 investment for $22, $23, $24, right? And what happens when you're buying on margin, right? Right? You buy it for $250, somebody gives you $300, you're making triple your money because you've only put down $2. There was no effort by the state to enforce any of the terms of the mortgages that they provided. You're supposed to pay it all off in 6 years. Nobody bothered. What happened is a bunch of those wise speculators, clever speculators, seeing another way to make money easily, right, would put their money down. It's sort of like when you buy an option on a piece of property, right, like an oil company might, and they never have to pay another dime if they don't want to. They could just lose it. No penalty. They lose their 10 pounds if it doesn't sell. Or find somebody to pay just a little bit more, and then they make a profit, right? So a whole lot of speculators got involved, right? And so the result was nobody comes along to pay the money that they want. The farmers can't pay it. There's no money for them. And so the state has to go back and enact all these laws for the, what do they call it, relief of the buyers of the land, right? I mean, it gets even more interesting, okay? On the left, all those dark ones are ones that required new mortgages from the state, not getting paid off in 6 years, which would be by 1802. But by 1808 and 1818, all those lots had a mortgage on at least part of it, right? And in the middle here, trying to find out when somebody paid off their land to the state, okay? All these ones with a crosshatch, the state doesn't know if it was ever paid off. They lost the records, and then there was a fire, right? And some of them, 51 to 73 years is the darkest color. In other words, you can complain a lot about what happened there if you're a part of the citizens that want to prevent the Cayuga taking over land. But it's very possible your ancestors or whoever they bought the land from never paid for it. So it's just one of those ironies, right? But what it got me interested in, this is, by the way, all the laws, don't read them, all the laws the state enacted for relief, okay? As part of the reservation, it's been a bid off at prices so far beyond its value because these speculators were in there buying options, and then if it didn't work out for them, just letting them go, right? An investment, not much, take what's lost. It gets more interesting. These are, okay, I don't really want to go into the details of the 4 syndicates. I figured out they were putting pressure on this land, right, to make the prices go so high. But one was the most interesting group in New York history in some ways, the New York Genesee Company of Adventurers. Okay, mostly rich people from Columbia County, and it included Schuyler's and Livingston's and others, right? And they decided they were going to take over all of the land west of Seneca Lake, and they made a deal with the four relevant nations of the Haudenosaunee to pay them $2,000 million a year for all their land, and the various groups were interested in that, and they signed an agreement. Now, New York State says you can't do that, right? Only New York State can buy land from the Indians, and New York State can't even because only the federal government can. But that's how that came about. So they're out there marauding in the countryside, and one of the things they do is they encourage a lot of people to settle on the reservation because that's almost the last piece of land they think they can get, as New York prevents them from getting it and the other land sold to those rich Europeans, like I showed you, and to the rich elites that own the land in the Morris Reserve and whatnot. So these are different groups that got settled on there. There was military conflict. There was a point when Abraham Hardenberg, who was leading a group, John L. Hardenberg's brother, right, had to hide out in an island in Cayuga Lake, wherever that is, right, and petition the governor to send an army, right, to protect him from these adventurers that had armed soldiers in the field. So that's one of the things that put pressure on this land. They thought they had the whole half the state, and they didn't have much. They also tried to do a filibustering event. You know what the word filibuster means? It's sort of like what Aaron Burr was trying to do out west, which was conquer some territory and take it over, right? That's the word they use, right? And so they thought, well, we'll just take this land. It'll be ours. We'll make it our own state. Well, that didn't work out for them. A bunch of people came up from the south who had, Harris and Bennett and Richardson were their names, and they started the ferry long before the reservation was sold, because it was bought, because they knew this was going to be the route west, right? And so if you're going west, this is why Auburn had its early start. You go through Auburn, you avoid Montezuma, right? And you go across the lake, right, to go west. And so that's why Auburnites could make good money selling things to the travelers with their Conestoga wagons that want to sell them tools, sell them a good meal, sell them some whiskey, right? And so that's how Auburn got its first development. The next group was the group that wanted to create a bridge, right? And you can still see the signs of the bridge there if you go to, what's it called, Cayuga, and you look across.
Mudlock.
What?
Mudlock.
Mudlock. Okay, you can see this, right? And so they get a group together, and they get really interested in, well, then these are the guys that bought Seneca Falls, right? And those are the lots they bought. So different groups were, and this is how much money they lost in Seneca Falls. Okay, but the group that wanted to build a bridge, okay, they secured all these lots, trying to get rich on a transportation route, right? And they actually got an agreement to build the bridge, but it kind of fell through because there wasn't enough money to support this wonderful business until Aaron Burr and his Manhattan Water Company group got together. If you know the history, Aaron Burr wanted a bank to compete with the Bank of the U.S., whatever, and so they got a water company that had banking abilities. And so the investors that actually built the bridge eventually were these investors from New York City. And that's kind of interesting, right? But they really didn't, but this group was the earlier group that got sort of cut out of the deal because they weren't New Yorkers. They weren't elite New Yorkers. So they got cut out of the deal. A couple years later, and that bridge the Cayuga Bridge, okay, was supposedly a marvel of its time. And boy, did it make money. I mean, it was amortized in 2 or 3 years. I mean, they were, you know what that means? Paying off all the debt, right? That bridge was really, really good. But an ice flow broke it, right? So a bunch of other people and the Manhattan Company, Burr was in jail or whatever. They didn't do anything with it. So the different group of local Seneca Falls people mostly rebuilt the bridge. And they made money for decades. So that was kind of cool for them. So let me finish with what's probably the most important lesson from this whole study, right? Which is you try to watch, you think, man, if you bought some land, you'd make a fortune. Get out there. You got any pennies in your pocket, you go buy some land, right? And all these different New Yorkers, Bostonians, et cetera, who ended up with these township-sized tracts, or these large companies like the Holland Land Company or the Pulteney Purchase people. They couldn't sell anything for money because nobody had any money, right, on the frontier. I mean, literally. I mean, you get quotes like, I really hate to go see these farmers and try to get the rent or the mortgage payments because it's like taking the last egg. There's no money. Until the Erie Canal, there's no place to sell anything, right? And so this may be a more interesting part of the book if you got into it. It's a sort of boring part at the end where you talk about rental and all that. But these farmers, I mean, they're not able to pay for their land, right? And they might have bought it for $3 an acre, thinking it was going to be valuable, and then not able to pay for it. I'm talking over the first decades of the 1800s. So you start looking at how these foreign proprietors did, right? Okay, by 1820, the Dutch were owed $4 million, right? They were still owed $7 million, okay, later, right? So, I mean, all kinds of stuff like this. To make money in the land business, you had to be there, right? You had to sell to your neighbor, you know, go with them to harvest, collect his. But until the Erie Canal was built, there was almost no place for any of these people to have money. But I think here we go. By 1819, the president of the local agricultural society estimated that settlers west of the Genesee River owed around $5 million in debt. Okay. Now, it has a kind of an interesting experience in that eventually, as soon as the settlers realized that they could vote and they could charge taxes from governments, they sort of drove the Holland Land Company from business, right? And so the Holland Land Company eventually sold out what was left. And let me see. Now, this one here, yeah. They sold all this acreage to whoever would buy it in the 1820s and 30s for about $1 an acre, right? Because nobody had any money to pay them. I mean, that's the story, right? But there's a part of me that also looks at the sales to those foreigners as well, right? I mean, think of how I have a very simple, but I think an absolutely ironclad theory of economic development, which is people have to have money in their pockets, right? If I have money in my pockets, I can pay you to build my barn, or I can pay you for some whiskey or whatever it is, right? And if I don't have money in my pockets, nobody can start a business to sell me anything, right? The way that America developed with so many farmers getting land all across the country as owners of their land, and eventually, remember, we started trying to give land away for $2 an acre, selling a section, which is 640 acres. Nobody had the $1,280 to pay for it, so they couldn't sell it. They reduced it to $1.25. Then around the Civil War, might have been Lincoln who did it, but the land policy of just giving it away, right? You have to settle on it. You have to live on it for 5 years and develop it, right? And so I'm thinking the person that gave me my name, Anderson, my Norwegian great-great-grandfather, settled in southern South Dakota in the 1860s, as soon as that was available, because it was great land. The sewer there, I mean, what the hell? But in any case, that's kind of interesting. If the land goes to you for free and you can raise cattle and you can raise corn, right, and you can sell it, then you're somebody can sell something to, right? Simple economic development. It's why Latin America developed so poorly, because most of the land was in the hands of the rich, right? And so the peasants didn't have any money. So the businesses that survived were ones that sold luxury goods to the rich people, right? So that stymied development. I think that same thing stymied development of Western New York. You look at the farmsteads all throughout Western New York, and they're not the same farmsteads you see in Iowa or southern Minnesota or whatever, not these beautiful, rich, successful farms. People struggled from the very beginning. Why? The money was going to Europe, right? Not a lot of it, but whatever you could come up with ended up going to Europe to pay the people that were sold that land so cheaply by those rather ill-advised government officials that decided the best way to deal with their land was to sell it as quickly as possible to some rich person. And the only people with money, turned out, virtually, were rich Europeans. So I sort of see that as an object lesson. You can agree with me or not. But boy, I've probably exercised your patience for a while, so I'll take questions. Just remember that I'm old and I forget a lot of stuff. So, yeah, hi.
Hi, thank you so much.
Okay.
Is there a conversion for the numbers you've given us into today's money?
Oh, in the court case, that was really a very important part, right? And it's in the back of the book, okay? Because they had experts from MIT and other places that gave you a year. Because you should know what happened to the court case. I left that one out, right? The court case was in the area of what, $35 million was the value of the land. And then what do you add to that? right? Over, I might be wrong with the numbers, over not owning it for 200 years, right? It's called prejudgment interest. And it went up to $250 million, right? 247 million. Does that sound right? Okay. So, of course, the state appeals it, and a appellate jury of 3 judges, 2 of whom were appointed by Reagan, decided, no, we're not going to pay them. You don't have to pay them. And the 2 reasons for that, right? And somebody wrote, Anderson says they can't sue because I didn't make up these rules. I'm just reporting what they did, right? One is called laches, right? Like if I sue you because your great grandfather stole a cow from me, they're going to go, that happened too long ago, right? So laches is that. And the other one is, jumped out of my head, but it means res juridica, something like that, right? Which is you can't sue for the same reason with the same evidence a second time, right? So those 2 things kind of stymie it, but I'm sure it's going to come back someday, right? Because one of the things you can sue for, this also happened. I mean, there's so much to tell. The federal government realized they had problems with all the Native American groups because they bought their land for next to nothing, right? All over the country, and often at the end of war and whatnot. So they wanted to rectify this, and they had a court of appeals for a while, but they had a commission that was that sat for 20, 25, 30 years to try to deal with all the cases. And there were 800 cases all over the country, and more than 500 were actually judged, right? And it was to pay them what the land was worth minus everything the U.S. government paid. Like every time you sent them a doctor or, sent them a load of blankets or something, right? And in the end, the federal government paid out about $800 million, right? So that was in the 1950s, right? So they did try to do something about it. I think that the reason that these cases could go back to trial, though, is if you prove that that's an insufficient judgment. That's one area where a lawsuit can be engaged. If they didn't get paid enough, you have a point. You can make a point. So that answer it? Yeah, hi.
What would the effect of them not having the correct signatures from the federal government, state government? Would that still stand as a reason for suing?
In other words, Congress didn't validate it, however they do a treaty, right? Ratify. They didn't ratify it, right? And that made this case one of the few that gets to go forward, right? There's very few. I was called, interestingly enough, by the Attorney General's Office of Ohio, right? And this was the problem they were facing. They never called me back, and I guess I can't make a business of this kind of expertise, right? But they said there was an island in Western Erie Lake Erie, right, that had been Canadian until the border was adjusted. It was adjusted north, now it's American, but they never had a treaty signed with the natives that had that island, right? So they were expecting to be sued. I don't think anything happened after the Cayuga case, right? It was an island of a mile square. But in any case, there's no cases to bring because only New York was stupid enough to not have it ratified. And they had the government there. They had Timothy Pickering there, who was the head of Indian Affairs at the time. And Washington said, it's too late. And George Clinton had stopped being governor. John Jay was governor, right? And Clinton was part of the review court to judge whether these cases were legitimate or not. I'm not sure the language for it. And he was against it, even though he'd been negotiating all this. But John Jay signed it, and so they could sue. Yeah.
Do you think there was intent to defraud the Cayugas?
Absolutely, in every step of the way, and not just the Cayuga, right? And in the Oneida case, because the Oneida had a much bigger reservation. I mean, there's books about that. I mean, and I think the thing that I learned, and I learned this more from the Taylor book than anybody else, is that for the Haudenosaunee at this time, it was about how are they going to feed themselves, right? They lost their hunting territory. They lost their farms. They lost their fishery of eel in Waterloo that I'd heard about. That was part of their deal with the state. And so how are they going to eat? right? They're not about to go to work in a factory. I mean, why would they spoil the absolutely wonderful life they lived, right? And so they were worried about getting paid, and they were worried that the money, if it's coming from Albany, is it going to stop at Cayuga Lake with the few that they dispute with, or is it going to make it all the way west where a lot of them are? A whole bunch of them moved with, you know who Joseph Brandt is?
Yes.
Okay, so Joseph Brandt is the angriest of all the Haudenosaunee, right? And I learned some interesting things about him. But he got the British to give the Haudenosaunee groups land on the Grand River in Canada, north of Lake Erie, and a whole lot of people moved there. And so today, if you go there, there's a lot of Cayuga, there's a lot of Seneca, there's a lot of different groups there, a lot of Mohawk, right? And then the Cayuga sort of matched with the Seneca. They're the big brother, little brother in the language of the group. And a lot of them went first to Ohio and then eventually to Oklahoma. So part of the lawsuit was the Cayuga Nation of New York and the Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma. So, yeah.
I don't know anything about the history of the Onondaga Reservation, but I was struck by the fact that your 1790s maps showed the Onondaga Reservation looking just the way it looks today, and the Cayuga Reservation, which is basically gone. What was different about the two reservations that one survived intact and one got?
I'm not an expert on this, except for the Onondaga, like the Oneida, had their reservations pared down bit by bit by fraudulent, you get some drunken young member of the tribe to sign something, and the next thing you know, they all have to, follow. They go before a judge, and the judge rules for the buyer. I mean, little by little, both the Oneida and the Onondaga Reservation got whittled down, but the Onondaga kept a little bit. What was it, 500 or 50? I don't know, very small amount. Well, you see the signs when you drive up 81, right? Yep. The Oneida have a much better argument, and they were fraudulently dispossessed, and that's what particularly Lawrence Altman writes about. But they kept a little bit, but then they got their casino and they started buying back, right? And so they sued to have a new reservation for them with all these lots they were buying. And the government, the Supreme Court said, no, your land is too disparate. It's not all contiguous. So you can't have a reservation, right? I will say this, that I guess I'm off the microphone. I will say this, one of the things that motivated me, though the money probably motivated me more, but one of the things that motivated me was the Attorney General's people that I dealt with said they had made an offer with the Cayuga for $120 million to settle the case. Now, I only heard that like the first week, right? But I'm going, that's fantastic. Boy, you know what $120 million could buy in 1999 in terms of land, just the profit from it? They could own half the state by now. And the prices have gone up since the Amish came, but and so I'm going, wow, But apparently the reason that, there was a lot of reasons why that would never go through, and especially it wouldn't go through because of the citizens against it that lived in the former reservation. Yep.
I just like to say, so I'm a Cayuga. I'm Cayuga. I'm a traditional Cayuga. I'm one of the Cayugas that he's talking about that is in Grand River in Canada. And the reason why I'm in Grand River, Canada was a result of the American Revolution, because the Cayuga Nation stayed neutral. We didn't pick sides. We didn't pick the United States sides or the British sides like history books want to write it. That is not true. So as the result of us being neutral in a war was the result of us losing our land. And when you guys are sitting here talking about money and things, the Cayugas wanted this, they wanted that. It's never about the money, it's about the land. And everything that I heard today from this gentleman and other gentlemen is true. Our land was stolen from us. We didn't sell our land, we didn't give up our land, we didn't sign treaties for our land. It was just outright stolen for us. That's why a lot of us ended up in Canada. there's Cayugas in New York State. You have Cayugas settled over there under Clint Halftown right now, who is Cayuga Nation of New York. You have Cayugas out in Oklahoma, because what the war did was it spread and broke up our nation. And I've only been coming back here for the last 25 years, back to my land. I live out near Union Springs, New York. We live on the 74-acre farm over there, and we're trying to make sense of what happened. What happened to our people? What happened to our land? Why did we lose, control of our land? We're trying to make sense of it ourselves. And when we hear stuff like what is being presented to you is stuff we know is factual, that our land was never relinquished or was never dealt with in a good legal way. We talk about deeds. We question deeds. We are looking at deeds right now because we wonder how deeds were written out and distributed to settlers on land that New York State had no right to be doing that. So right now, we're facing that, and we're looking for answers ourselves, and we're looking for justice ourselves too, because right now, as Cayuga people back on our land, Cayuga County wants to tax us on our land without no explanation of how can you tax a sovereign nation on their own land. So that's what we're facing right now, without anybody providing answers to why we're not here today, why we're not living on this land today. And as a result of it, I had to grow up in a different country. I had to grow up with other Haudenosaunee nations on one little reservation as the result of the war. And when I look at back how I ended up in Canada, it's just because after the war, the Cayugas were given special rights that we were supposed to return back to our land after the War of 1812 and pick up our lives the way that we lived prior to the wars, meaning our clan system, our traditional government, our ceremonies, our longhouses, just the way we lived on peace on the land. That's the way we were supposed to come back. But then by that time, you guys look at our reservations all lotted out. There is no land for us to come home. That's why we're not back here, because our land was settled even before the Treaty of 1814, the Treaty of Ghent, that said that the Cayuga Nation is going home after the wars and picking up their lives prior to the war. But look at, everything was gone. You're talking deeds, 1798, 1792. So even that shows us as Cayuga people that our land was illegally taken from us. And today, there's a small group of us coming home to our land, but there's nothing to come home to. Like, we have to purchase our own land for us to be here. We faced a lot of racism and discrimination from a lot of hate groups in the area, but we've overcome all of that stuff because this is our home too, and we're not going anywhere. We're just trying to figure out how we fit in and where we fit in. And we want to be good neighbors to everybody. We're not, we're not here to kick anybody off the land. We're not here to do anything. We're just here trying to create a life for ourselves and trying to make sense of what happened here. And when you talk about treaties, you talk about this stuff, yes, there was a problem with New York State signing that treaty that secured a 64,000-acre reservation because they signed it with an individual person. And yes, Cayugas got upset by it. We demanded that New York State not sign treaties with individual. It wasn't ratified by Congress. The chiefs at Buffalo Creek, along with Cayuga chiefs, stopped that treaty from going any further and reminding New York State of that. So some of your facts is true, but when it talks about us pushing for money, we've never pushed for money because we wanted our land back, and that's what we want back today. So we're facing all of these things right now as Cayuga people, and it's not really fair for us to have to sit here and explain ourselves and who we are as Cayuga people on our own land. We're looking for land back at Wells College, which is closing, because that was one of our villages, and that was one of the last villages destroyed by the Sullivan campaign. And there's never been any explanation to why, yes, we don't have no access to any of our land. We're on a little parcel of 64,000 acres, and the Cayuga Nation of New York has parcels that they had to purchase back. So it's really difficult for us, like it's kind of hurtful, like me sitting here as a Cayuga woman, kind of like listening to that and listening to your claims of factual stuff. And it's really kind of hard to sit in a forum like this as a Cayuga woman and a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, because not only the Cayugas are facing this, every other nation, but the Cayuga Nation, we're the only nation that is landless. Like, what happened to our reservation? We had a reservation, then we had a smaller reservation, and we don't have none of that today. And we don't even have lake access to Cayuga Lake. Like, you're talking about eels, harvesting eels. Like, we harvest everything out of Cayuga Lake, but we don't do that today because we don't have access to any of it as a Cayuga person. And so I really commend you for the work you have done and the insight that you're creating for a lot of settlers, because a lot of this stuff needs to be has to be a mutual understanding of what happened here, because I know there's a lot of residents and a lot of people today that are living on that Cayuga reservation. And how you acquired the land is what we're asking the same question too, because we don't know the answers, we don't know what happened, but we're here, and like I said, we're not going anywhere, and we just want to feel like we're a part of this so-called Cayuga reservation also, because we're the Cayuga people. Dan Hill here, he's been one of the oldest Cayugas living here. We've only been back for like 25 years. This is like new to us too. So by us coming to Auburn here and be using, the services, meeting the people here, it's been quite welcoming. Like, people welcome here. They don't discriminate against us or anything like that. And that's like really so unusual for a Cayuga woman to feel like I can be out in society as a Native person in this territory because of the hostilities of the past and the racism and discrimination. I fully don't feel safe here as a Cayuga woman on my own land, because I don't know what happened here. I don't know how it happened or anything. But Dan Hill, he's been one of our Cayugas that's been settling here for longer than any other Cayuga so far. And yeah, we face a lot here too, and it's just it's hard sometimes, and it's hard because we're trying to understand why we are being taxed on our land, the land that we never rescinded any control over. And that's what my question was, with land taxes today, what is it based on today, land taxes in Cayuga County or on Cayuga Reservation? Because you really look at it as a sovereign nation, we don't pay taxes. So look over the years since Cayuga County has been collecting taxes on Native land, and we don't pay taxes on our land. I know that sounds a little bit, far-fetched and all that, but we're sovereign people. And so that's what my question is how the county is able to collect tax on sovereign Cayuga land.
It's interesting. Yeah. Well, do you have comments too that you'd like to share?
I do, but I don't want to get too involved. I have been here since '05, and I've only had like 2 people make racial comments to me.
Yeah.
Probably because I'm bigger than they are. And so there's other things that we need to get along with as far as living together. We're trying to keep things, we're sharing. Right? The share farm is called Strengthening Haudenosaunee and American Relationships Through Education. So we want people to understand how to live in the natural world, how not to destroy the land, the waters, and the air. That's the 3 things that we really push. I work for the EPA for the Cayuga Nation, for the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. I went to Washington, D.C. on a tribal operations committee. So all the nations in the United States are 10 regions, and they all brought their issues to the United States EPA and worked with that. One of the biggest things we worked with is the Bristol Bay in Alaska, where they stopped the mine from putting dump stuff in a ditch, which would have killed the salmon for that whole area. We stopped that, but then when Trump got in here the first time, he descended that. Now you look at Gaza, and that's his. That's his. He's taking it. So the situation is still going on. It's not just us, it's everybody else. And that's why I don't want to go on too far, because I really have a lot to say about things that
Yeah.
you need to be aware of what is really happening, because it's still continuing.
Can I ask, sir, is there, it sounds like there's some degree of communication and working together between the various tribal nations. Is that happening to some extent locally with the Oneidas or the Onondagas, et cetera?
We have a Grand Council, what we call Grand Council, and we all meet at the Onondaga Nation, which is just 2 lakes over. And all the 5 nations, 6 nations people come together and we council. And that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's still going on from even when the Cayugas were settled here. We would travel to Onondaga and council, and we do that still today. So the nations that meet up there is the Onondaga Nation, who are the fire keepers. You got the Mohawk Nation, you got the Oneida Nation, you got the Seneca Nation, you got the Tuscarora Nation, and the Cayuga Nation. And we all gather and we all bring our chiefs, our clan mothers, and our faith keepers who make up the traditional government. We all travel to Onondaga and we all bring our issues there from each nation. And we sit there and discuss it and we come to consensus decision making. And if we can't come to a consensus decision, we call we put it under our pillow. Means that we take it home with us and we put it under our pillows. And when it's time, we take it out of our pillows when it's time. And it could be a week, could be 2 days, could be 3 days, whatever, because it gives us the time to think about what decision we need to make. So we don't make haste decisions when it comes to decision making. So we still do that today. And every other nation has their own nation council, just like Cayuga Nation. We have our own Cayuga Nation Council, which is comprised of 10 chiefs and 10 clan mothers, 10 clan families. And we still meet and we still govern. We meet monthly at our meetings, so we're still functioning yet. We still have our longhouses. Our ceremonies still go on yet. Our Cayuga language is still alive and well, right from our children right to our elders. And we take pride in carrying a lot of that stuff on. A lot of other nations have taken on the Cayuga language as their own language in their nations. So Cayuga language is spoken pretty predominantly out there. And the Cayuga Nation is kind of like a role model right now for the other Haudenosaunee nations on how a nation functions through a traditional government. So we're kind of setting the example for the other nations, meaning that we govern ourselves with our clan families under our chief and our clan mother. And myself personally, I just became a faith keeper to my clan mother last year. So it still shows that we're still carrying on in our traditional government. So we're still here today. And the things we did on that Cayuga reservation, or even prior to it being a Cayuga reservation, is the stuff that the Cayuga people still carry on today. And it's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's going to continue as long as our Cayuga people are here.
So I'm interested in, for 100 years or so, there was among the American Western discourse, or the idea that the Native Americans disappeared, right? And if I'm not mistaken, there's many more Cayuga today than there were.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, there were like 1,000 of them at the Revolution, and now there's so many more.
Yeah.
So you didn't disappear.
No, we didn't. No,
Yeah.
because like they tried everything. Okay, like we ended up in a different country. Like they tried to, just try to get rid of us in any way they could. Even today, they're still trying to do that. Yeah, like even the Indian schools or the residential schools, and there's like tons of policies out there that that are still trying to assimilate us or colonize us still today, and we're still facing that today. So we have like a fight every day for who we are as a traditional people, because nobody doesn't want a traditional Cayuga people. Nobody doesn't want traditional people, because when you talk about traditional people, you're talking about treaty rights, you're talking about sovereign nations, you're talking that. And today nobody wants to talk that language anywhere in Canada or the United States, because they can't recognize another sovereign nation within a sovereign nation. So they rather not have traditional Cayugas, traditional Onondagas, or anybody, because right now the Onondaga Nation is our neighbor to us, and they face the same things that we face over there. And it's always our identity trying to be erased from society.
They still recognize our status,
Yeah.
because when they're taking nuclear waste from the Lake Huron and up in Canada, then bringing it down across the Peace Bridge, down 90, down 81, and they wanted Onondaga to have a hazmat crew that would go and work on the accident with the tailings of the nuclear waste. And then they go down 81 into North Carolina. And so wherever it goes from there, it's probably in the ocean somewhere. But they still have to make us aware of what's going on, because it is our land, and they have to admit it, because they made the 1794 treaty that nobody, state or municipality, can deal with Native people without the federal government being involved.
Yes.
In our land base, like our original land base, is like, it's not 64,000 acres of Cayuga Reservation. Our land base originally is 1.3 million acres. And that goes right from the Pennsylvania state line right up to Lake Ontario. So, and how we lost control of the 1.3 million acres is another story and another quest to find answers to that. So you're talking 64,000 acres, like we're talking 1.3 million acres of land. And there's nobody providing answers for us. And right now, when you talk traditional people and traditional Cayugas, like nobody in this county or Seneca County wants to talk traditional because again, it goes back to the treaties and it goes back to people have to answer how this thing got broken up into all these hundreds of lots and where the land went to today and why people who haven't paid for their lots are still able to, carry on. And so there's been no justice, and you're talking like money that's owed to Cayuga Nation. Like, yeah, there's like millions of dollars if you want to look at, the dollars and the facts and the taxes, everything put it together. Yeah, like there's millions and probably billions of dollars that's owed to Cayuga Nation. But like again, we're not about the money. We're about the land.
Yeah.
I'm honored to be friends with John and Dan. I'm glad they are here today and speaking. I live on a property at the southern edge of the map, one of the ones that was all black, so it was like one of the highest paid for. Kind of interesting. I'm a big supporter of finding creative pathways for land back so that we can live in a true community and, try and find resolution for this divide. I think that's the only way that's really going to truly heal and enrich our Finger Lakes area, not just Cayuga County, Seneca County, the whole Finger Lakes area, is, suffering from this elephant, this what has been swept under the rug for hundreds of years. So when wells closed, I created a petition, change.org, wells land back, to find a way to put that land back into the hands of the traditional Cayuga. If you're interested in signing and supporting that petition, it's change.org, wells land back. You can come to me. I also have created a nonprofit to put together people who are, on the ship side of the 2-row in Cayuga County, in Seneca County, and Tompkins County, who want to be friends and allies to the traditional Cayuga and try to be a bigger, stronger voice. Because I don't know if you're aware of Noon. Noon is neighbors of Onondaga Nation, and they're a supportive group of Onondaga Nation, but there's no formal organization to support the Cayuga people from, our ship side of the 2-row. So if you're interested in being part of that, please leave your email with me. I'll find after that.
All right.
Oh, and we're here to buy one of your books.
Oh, don't buy them. Take them. I hope you're not stuck here waiting for your book, But the comment I'd make with that is they're absolutely right. The land was definitely taken. You could say fraudulently. I mean, because the Americans from the colonial period used the law to get the Indian land, but they controlled the law. Right, and there's a pretty good book, How the Indians Lost Their Land by Stuart Banner, Harvard University Press. And he talks about how early on the settlers were very conscious about making very legal agreements because there were few of them and there were many of the native people. And over time, that completely reversed. And then it was just beat them on the battlefield, force them to sign, and take the land. And that's most of the country was taken that way. So I'm not going to disagree with any of those arguments, but I would say that to change things, you got to vote for different politicians, and they have to appoint different judges. And I have seen no hope for that in the immediate future, but you never know. And I think that would be an argument for a lot of things right now. Go ahead.
Build community support.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, thank you for your comments. I just do the numbers. I'm not into the other side of it, right? Oh, and maybe you'd be interested in this. When I recalculated the numbers using an appropriate method, using the judge's method, but calculating it without using a single figure for rental every year, I came up with 1.2 billion as the settlement. And I think those large numbers sort of end settlements. The government's not going to pay to give $1 billion for a township. But I mean, so that's why I think a negotiation I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not very positive about the future of your ambitions, frankly.
I know.
You know, but it's nice to be able to air them out. And,
Yeah.
come get your books. I'll stand here and answer any more questions.
So